Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Frédéric Leroy, a professor of food science and biotechnology at Free University of Brussels. Dr. Leroy has published over 180 articles in scientific journals, which have been cited over 18,000 times. In our conversation, we discuss the risks of vegan diets, the unique nutritional and societal roles of meat and animal source foods, the push toward sustainable diet, and the controversies surrounding the EAT-Lancet report. We also talk about our collaboration on the Nourishment Table and how to find a flexible, evidence-based approach to healthy eating. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Dr. Frédéric Leroy, welcome to the show. Great to see you.
Hi, Ty.
So you're very passionate about getting the science right about meat and animal source foods, livestock, just as you are about getting the policies and messaging to the public, which you've really started to, I think, put a lot of time and energy into over the last several years. So how did you sort of transition from being, I believe, primarily a meat scientist, food scientist, into studying the nutritional, environmental, and societal role of meat and livestock?
Yeah, well, I'm not particularly a meat scientist as such. Meat scientists, they look at meat quality and how that relates to the animal feed, and so forth. And I'm a food scientist in general. I have worked on other things than animal source foods as well. But I was trained as a food engineer in a way, process technology, and then I did a master thesis on a purely nutritional topic of food security in Africa. But I just find the animal source foods very interesting as such for multiple reasons, and they were part of my case studies, things I was looking at specifically, but also because of the controversy and the polarization. I just find it very interesting from almost anthropological point of view as well.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating. It's really quite pronounced how polarizing and how passionate people get on this topic from all sides. So I think seeing that happen online and even among scientists, I think is really telling. Can we talk about this kind of, I guess, the one extreme, which is sort of this vegan diet, fully plant-based approach? You've done a bit of work on this, including some papers in the American Journal for Clinical Nutrition with Neil Bernard, who's a researcher who's, I believe, a vegan, very, very sort of prominent researcher, very passionate about plant-based diets. And it was this series called, Great Debates in Nutrition. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and that experience?
Well, I think it's a great format. I was contacted by David Ludwig, who was the acting editor. So he came up with the Great Debates initiative, and asked me to defend animal source foods, and then Neil Bernard was supposed to take the opposite position, and it was a statement that was thrown at us, and the statement was something along the lines of animal source foods should be avoided by all population groups to reduce chronic disease. And we took the opposite positions. We had each a paper, and then a rebuttal, and then a rebuttal to the rebuttal, then finally a consensus paper, which I think is great because you have the interaction. You also try to find common ground. There wasn't much to be in that box, but okay. And then the points of difference. So you can really lay out very clearly what the differences are. It doesn't get diluted in the conversation. You really have to list them and then let the evidence speak. And then the nice thing is that the readers can make up their own mind after reading the papers.
I think I saw the consensus. There was one bullet and it said 2 + 2 = 4. Right? Wasn't that the?
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah. But it was interesting to see quite a bit of disagreement. But you have a chance to really explore the argument in detail, and not just in a conversation, right? It's actually rigorously going through and looking at the evidence and presenting your argument. So I found that really valuable. And I agree, for readers who truly want to know what does the evidence say? It's a really good format to see from two experts on different sides of an issue, right? So can we talk a little bit now about the risks of vegan diets, or we think about nutrients, health outcomes, any particular issues around life stages for vegan diets?
Yeah. Well, maybe the first thing I want to stress here is that because sometimes I come across as an anti-vegan scientist, which is absolutely not the case. I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to diets, and even beyond diets, let's say. So for me, freedom on the plate is very important. If a vegan diet works for you, then just, and you're happy with it, I will by no means try to interfere with this. So I want to have that clear. The reason why I'm taking these positions is because I think as an academic, it is my responsibility to make sure that we have the factual information and the evidence-based information out there. And it's just my responsibility to react to the points of view which I think are not sustained by the evidence. And then secondly, of course, as a citizen, I'm also worried about the fact that imposing vegan ways of eating upon certain population groups can be risky, and that's the answer to your question, I guess. So I think we have to be very careful if we expand this diet beyond the group of people that follow it, under their own responsibility, and especially for groups with higher needs. I think it's a restrictive diet. It throws out several food groups. You can say, of course, animal source food, so one food group, but actually it's an umbrella terminology for eggs, for dairy, for fish, for meat. I forget a few. And so if you make your diets restrictive, they become less robust. And that's why it may work for some people that approach it very carefully, that do have the constitution to handle those diets. But it may be risky for those people that are not having the proper resources and knowledge, but also then are closer to the risky domain of nutrient intake. And then of course we talk about young women, young females, lactating pregnant women, but also young adolescent females. We talk about children, infants. We talk about older adults. We talk about the metabolically compromised people that have metabolic challenges, and so forth. And then it becomes much more difficult. Again, it may not be impossible, but you're taking risks which I think should probably be avoided. And those risks, well, you've talked about it. There's a whole list of things we can mention on the nutrient side level. There are several nutrients that are more difficult to source from plants only. You can supplement, you can try to combine plant sources. You can take your best precautions to that as best as good as you can, but it is sometimes not all that easy. And it's the way it's represented in public discourse is sometimes quite optimistic.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the specifics now. If you think about nutrients, which ones are you most concerned with? I mean, you think about when populations consume low animal source foods naturally because they're in poverty, so in lower income contexts, but also in these which we have seen a few studies out looking at, in a wealthy context, in a high income country, trying to compare a vegan diet to a omnivorous diet. What are the challenges that you see in terms of nutrient adequacy?
Well, there are a couple of classical nutrients that usually pop up, like vitamin B12, of course, is a typical one. We have the commonly addressed point that iron deficiency may show up. Calcium deficiency is sometimes mentioned. A range of other B vitamins in some cases. Some minerals that are also not always that easy to find, like iodine, if you don't have fortified staple foods. But also some nutrients we talk less about, we address it to a lesser degree. DHA, for instance, as a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, is not an easy one. Choline is pretty difficult. Vitamin D, vitamin A in some cases. So there's a range, and it really depends on the quality of the foods you're consuming and the access you have to fortification and supplements. But I guess those are the often mentioned ones that
How
sometimes
about
fall up.
how about protein? Do you see any issue with vegan populations having inadequate protein or suboptimal protein?
It depends also where you put your protein needs. So we have the often mentioned 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day, which is considered to be a level of protein intake that corresponds with the replenishment of your nitrogen requirements in mostly healthy people. But again, if you have higher demands for growth, for muscle recovery, for because of metabolic illness, you may need higher proportions, and you can reach it with plant proteins as well. It may mean higher volumes. It may mean more calories in some cases. It may also mean that if you really want to hit the high levels, you may have to consider proteins, isolates or protein powders. You can reach it with plant proteins, but again, you make it more difficult.
And then there's this bioavailability issue, right, where you don't necessarily have the same quality, the same amount of essential amino acids. So you can have some challenges with certain amino acids if you're not kind of combining diverse sources of plant proteins, right?
Right. So the higher your protein quality is, the closer you can stick, I guess, to the 0.8 level. And again, you would probably prefer higher targets than the 0.8. But the higher your protein quality is, the easier it becomes to hit the target.
Yeah. Okay. So, in short, a lot of concerns around nutrients. So, you make it harder. It's basically restricting the diet in a way that prevents you from being able to get all the nutrients you need unless you're very, very intentional, right? And you have access to all of the diverse foods, potentially supplements or fortified foods.
Yes. And
Now,
again, if your own body also supports it, which may not always be the case. It's so. What is often underestimated is the individual variation at the level of nutrient requirements. Okay, we try to cover that with the RDAs and at population level, but still, people can be very, very different. I mentioned DHA before, so the way people convert fatty acids, for instance, differs. The way we convert the provitamin A into retinol, there's several factors there that may be responsible for failure. Some people on vegan diets, whereas other people can be more comfortable on such a diet.
And then, so there's a variation, but there's also, I think we didn't really highlight this, but the bioavailability of the plant sources is really quite limited in many cases. So B12, there's really barely any bioavailable B12 in plants. There's these very specific types of seaweed that have potentially some bioavailable B12, but it's not something that's practical to scale up globally. And then you have things like vitamin A. On average, it's about 1/12 of
Yes.
the absorption, right? Converting from these plant-based carotenoids like beta carotene in a carrot or an orange sweet potato. You have bioavailability issues with iron, with zinc because of inhibitors, and we don't have heme iron, which is more bioavailable, which is lacking in plants. There's other issues beyond just the macronutrients, right? So I think that is omega-3s you talked about, DHA. So you can get algae supplements, but again, if that's the solution worldwide, that everyone has to be able to purchase and afford these expensive DHA algae supplements, that's a big challenge. But in general, the conversion is very poor from these plant sources of ALA. Things in, flax seeds or chia seeds, those types of things, it's maybe at best 10-1, oftentimes less when you look at the actual conversion. So if we look at, so nutrients are one thing, and they have their own implications, but I think a lot of people really want to know what are the health outcomes, right? Because, maybe the nutrient status appears to be diminished or there's some sort of challenge, but does that translate into health status, health outcomes? And I think what I'm curious to know from your perspective is a lot of advocates of the highly plant-based or vegan diets are looking at things like heart disease specifically. They're looking at longevity. So trying to understand, how does this affect your overall lifespan or health span. Can you talk about these health outcomes? But maybe on the concerning side, do you see anemia? Do you see issues with bone health? Do you see muscle? Like, what is it that you're really concerned about with vegan?
Well, so I've been looking at some point at the case reports coming out of the medical literature, right? And okay, I know they're in the hierarchy of evidence, they're always a bit poo-pooed, but I don't think that's really fair, because in the case of infants and young children, we do have very, very concerning case reports described for vegan, described when they put on vegan diets. And that includes things like failure to thrive, rickets, anemia, psychosis, all sorts of neurological pathologies in the eyes and the brain, really, really serious cases.
And I should say, really quickly before you continue, case studies. So these are probably more important in this case because at the population level, so few people actually consume a fully vegan diet long term. It's even in the US, it's about 1% at any given time, right? So the case study, it's sort of like if there's this movement to scale up vegan diets or plant-based diets at a higher and higher, then what are going to be the implications? Well, you do need to go to some of these other evidence sources because the population level data is not necessarily going to pick up on that.
Right. Yes. And so they give you a kind of potential description of the potential impact of those diets. And because of the seriousness of it, I think we should take it very carefully. I noticed people often refer to the report on vegan and vegetarian diets coming out of the American Nutrition and Dietetics Association, where they say that basically you can go ahead as long as you supplement B12. Well, on the other hand, we also have many pediatric associations globally, from France, from Germany, from Italy, I think even from Spain, and those are much more careful. In Belgium, we have the Royal Academy of Medicine, we have the Superior Health Council that are specifically warning that in the case of young children, we should be very, very careful. The Swiss have done the same thing. There's a whole list of professional associations that are warning against vegan diets. And I think we just go very lightly over it, and we have to be very, very careful if we're going in that direction. We don't have, as we say, we don't have the data, we don't have studies on this as such, because of course you can't pass an ethical commission to start a study like this, because the expected outcome is trouble. So we have to rely on other indicators, and I think so. On top of the medical literature looking into young populations, we just have the warning coming out of both the global south and history, archaeology, when people were switching from hunter-gatherer diets to the Neolithic diets, which are mostly, again, plant-based and cereal-based, that at least in some plant-based scenarios, things can go in a very wrong direction. Of course, a lot will depend on the quality of the foods, but so if we talk about plant-based, the plant-based terminology carries a lot of weight. Which plants are we talking about? How rich in nutrients are they? How are they combined? How do they meet the individual needs? How do they fit into the dietary patterns of a certain population? It's a complicated affair, and just stripping it down to, well, plant-based diets can be fine for everyone as long as you supplement with B12. I don't think that's a very good starting position.
Yeah, your point that there are many other organizations outside of the U.S. that do not endorse the safety of a vegan diet for all life stages. I think that's important. People think, oh, in the U.S., here we go. I'll just rely on that. And again, that information really depends on who's involved in the scientific bodies, right? So it's not a completely unbiased.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, so at least, I don't know if it's a new paper out now, but the most recent one at least there were 3 authors. The first one was a writer of raw vegan cookbooks. The second one was a 7-day Adventist. And the third one was a member of PCRM, which is a PETA-linked activist association. So that's quite it's a conflict of interest.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so there's lots of concerns even on the health side that you mentioned, but do you see, there's often this talk of the blue zones where it's very highly plant-based for longer lived populations. What do you say to people who say, look, the evidence says that the heart disease is lower and people live longer, and people don't have as much obesity on these vegan diets, and so why shouldn't we continue to eat fully vegan into older adulthood for our lifespan?
Yeah. So my opinion here is that we need to be careful if we come up with strong recommendations like this. It depends on the quality of the evidence. So that's where I usually try to refer to the principles of evidence-based medicine. At some point in medicine, some people thought, well, we need a stronger evidence base here because a lot of claims are being thrown at us and they're not always based on sufficient quality of evidence. So a framework has been developed to factor in the quality of the certainty of the evidence and relate it to what you can state or not state in the public domain. The grade system is the most developed, the most used, the gold standard system here. And in the cases where the chronic disease associations are mentioned and related to animal source foods, typically the certainty of the evidence is either low or very low. Now, in such cases, the grade system would say you have to be careful. You cannot come up with top-down recommendations and top-down advice because the evidence doesn't allow you to do so. And there are all sorts of reasons why the evidence is of low certainty. But the important part is that in such cases, you should bring the communication down from the policy level top down to a negotiation between a patient, consumer, individual, and a health practitioner, whether that's a dietitian or an MD or whatever. And then you negotiate based on the needs and the preferences and the trade-offs of that specific situation. Now, take for instance, if you have if you're a middle-aged male and you're prone to accumulate iron in your liver, well, it may be worthwhile to consider your red meat intake as a potential factor in this, and you may have to be very careful about your red meat intake, unless you give blood regularly and you have ways to deal with it. Right. If you're, however, someone in need of more iron, which is often the case for young females, in particular because of the blood losses, well, then you wanna contrast the evidence of low certainty related to chronic disease with the need for iron for your physiology, and especially also take that or evaluate this within the broader context of different health markers and all the other information your health practitioner will have access to.
Yeah, and I spoke with Gordon Guyot last week, and so check out the episode before this, listeners. But we did get into this sort of evidence-based medicine and grade in particular. So in general, there's very low certainty evidence for a lot of these things. So you're saying to be cautious with being overly confident or prescriptive about this is what needs to happen, right? It's sort of considering all of the evidence in context. And then I hear in life stages, infants and young children is a really concerning stage, right? To try veganism. So 6 to 23 months, very consequential if nutritional needs are not met during that phase, in that period. But then you also have adolescents, you have women of reproductive age, so this 15 to 49 years of age. You have older adults that often have trouble eating enough protein and enough calories, so having more animal source foods can be helpful. So there's I think there's a lot of potential nuances in that discussion. So let's talk about the other side of things. Okay, now we don't need to go full carnivore, but when we think of omnivorous diets, what do you hear are people's biggest concerns about meat from a nutritional perspective, about meat and other animal products that you have sort of face like in a regular basis?
Well, besides the health discussion, you quickly have conversations around sustainability, the environmental impact, sustainability, the ethical side of things is often mentioned, and those are again very complicated discussions on their own. So that any of those three big debates around animal source foods, whether that's nutrition, environment, or ethics, are very complicated discussions. They're very contextual. And the problem is that they're very much also simplified in the usual narratives that we hear, whether that's media or in your daily conversations. A lot of simplification, a lot of reductionism, and that's not very helpful. I know it's difficult because it requires a lot of information and knowledge and insights to be able to navigate those three debates. But it's not helpful if we're going to stereotype it and bring it down to simplistic statements.
Some of the things that I hear, I think the big three in terms of nutrition are red meat, processed meat, and saturated fat. So can you tell us a little bit about the evidence of these different potential health risks from animal source foods?
Well, red meat and processed meats actually have been addressed by the great people. So Bradley Johnston did it, and his colleagues, they performed they did a series of articles on that specific topic, and they came to the conclusion that the evidence is indeed low to very low certainty, depending on what you're looking at. And then, importantly, they also had a paper specifically on the preferences of people, and I think this paper in that series of articles has been misunderstood because people were not able to place it. But it is because within the GREAT approach, you would have to factor in the preferences and the needs of people. If there's a strong preference, and it's part of the deliberation, right? So if people really like meat, and the evidence is of low certainty, then the conclusion of that process is that we shouldn't recommend a reduction of the intake levels compared to the current state of intake levels. Now, that statement, of course, created a whole controversy, and a whole it escalated quite a bit, actually. But that was the conclusion of that comprehensive review process and meta-analysis. Then saturated fat comes with similar polarized debates, where people have concluded that, look, saturated fat and chronic disease outcomes, if you look at the quality of the certainty of the evidence, well, in most cases it comes out as neutral anyway, and it also depends on the context again. So what do you mean with saturated fat? If the intake is as whole foods elements within a healthy background diet, there's no particular reason for concern, unless you have really excessive situations, or when you have people that are high responders to saturated fat, you may again take it down to a patient health practitioner discussion. But at the population level, it's the saturated fat recommendations for me are among the problematic ones you still find out there in those recommendations or sets of recommendations.
I think with saturated fat, many of the studies included trans fat in the saturated fat group, which is very problematic. How do you disentangle the effects from those two very different fats?
There are lots of things, but for me, the main problem still for me, and the more I look at this, the more I'm convinced that the main problem is still that you obtain your data within very specific cultural settings. So you take a population, which very often are health practitioners, or nurses, health professionals, which are very specific. You look at how they eat, and you make conclusions about a certain food or food group in that population and health outcomes. And then the correlation causality thing becomes an issue, because there's so much going on there, and it's very tricky to make those to generalize conclusions to entire population. That's why if you look at the pure cohort, the pure cohort is a global study with all sorts of different countries from different places with completely different cultures, and interestingly, they find very different findings than than a lot of the Eurocentric or Eurocentric recommendations. Like whole grains come out as neutral, whole fat dairy seems to be better than low fat dairy, saturated fat associates with benefit rather than red meat again seems to be protective. So it's almost everything upside down. And the reason may as well be because you're looking at a very different population group. And in some populations group, you will find, culture specific outcomes because of healthy user bias, because of what people believe, and what they have been fed as information, and the way they position their diets as a social way of, diets are extremely important as a social signal. People eat in specific ways. to make social statements. And so depending on the social class you look at, you will get different results. And I know sometimes people correct for socioeconomics and so forth, but it doesn't capture the whole picture.
It's impossible to adjust for
Absolutely.
everything out there, right? I think when I look at saturated fat, I think it's generally relatively neutral. And I think what you said, there are population groups that have elevated cholesterol and ApoB from saturated fat proportion of the population. So for those folks, it really could make sense to limit, but it's not necessarily applicable to everyone, right? Red meat, I think, really depends on the context. If you are low in iron, it's probably great to have a lot. If you're very, if you have plenty of iron, and you are prone to, like you said, hemochromatosis or something where you can't get rid of that, then it makes sense to limit. So context matters. What about processed meat? So I know you said with this, and you were talking about, for listeners, this NutriRex series of reviews in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2019. And the evidence actually, from my understanding, was saying there's some risk from processed meat, red meat, but it's very low certainty. It's not enough to really change the recommendation. Can you tell us about the different types of processing? Because one of the things that I think is very clear from my perspective is that processed meat gets lumped together, but it's very different. There is ultra processed meat in the US that resembles very little of the actual animal original product, and then there's very traditionally processed meats where it could just have salt in the processing of that. Can you tell us about the potential health differences in the processing types of meat?
So processed meats are probably among the oldest processed foods we know. It's probably one of the first things we started to process originally as Homo sapiens. And that probably involved things like smoking or drying or even rotting, fermenting. And traditional societies throughout the ages have perfectionated that process and have come up with a huge variety of different processed meats. Including nowadays also some of the ultra-processed meats. In general, I think we need to be very careful with the word processed, because processed comes often with very negative connotations. Let's not forget that processing is one of our biggest assets. The problem is indeed when we go to experimental processing, hyper processing types of interventions, which are very different. But there are a lot of time-tested scenarios out there that have been extremely valuable over the ages. In some countries, processed meats were absolutely staples because of the fact that if you have barren landscapes or you have long winter periods, processing your meat was extremely valuable. But it depends on what you do. If you're going to heavily smoke your meats, you may end up with chemical compounds that could be carcinogenic. Okay, and again, if you have the ultra processed variants where you take something like deep fried nuggets, for instance, that's probably something you wouldn't want to recommend as a food that you better minimize that intake. But you also have something like a Parma ham, so as they make it in Italy, or San Daniele hams. Those are essentially muscle and they're salted. They don't even have nitrates and nitrite. They're just salt. They have a different different chemical transformation process that creates the same color but those are just muscle, meat, and salt, and it will not be the biggest part of your diet anyway. The way the Italians deal with processed meats is that it supplements their diets. And now in Flanders, we have a almost zero tolerance on processed meats coming from the official guidelines. So we have created a new pyramid system, and then the processed meats were thrown out.
Did you say pyramid scheme or did you say
there's a
pyramid system?
Yeah, pyramid scheme.
I'm just kidding.
Almost. No, it's actually now it's a double pyramid that they kind of copied the Barilla approach to sustainable eating. But there's a pyramid and there's a red circle outside of the pyramid where you'll find all the alcohol and candies and chocolate and also processed meats, all of them. And
yeah, it's very hard for me, I think, that really extreme view, because we don't make recommendations on any other foods really like that. I mean, sometimes we do if it's very, very well known, but like trans fat. But like even sugar sweetened beverages, usually it's like limit the amount of added sugar or free sugars, right? To 5% or 10%. For some reason, processed meat gets lumped into
Yeah.
you can't have any processed meat
Right.
within a healthy diet, which I think, even the WHO, it's not like official guidelines, but there's sort of this little to no processed meat. And like what you're saying is it's usually a small part of a meal, right? And it's the main issue there, if it's a minimally processed meat, is just how much sodium are you having? Do you have issues with blood pressure? Are you having enough potassium, right? That's I think an issue for some people. But there's also all sorts of beneficial nutrients in processed meat.
Yes.
Highly bioavailable protein, micronutrients, and that piece, to see it lumped in with candy,
Right.
sugar sweetened beverages that contain no nutritional value and only nutritional risk. That just feels like a misclassification to
Yeah.
me.
Well, in my region, it's very common to go, if you go to school and you have a lunchbox, people often have sandwich types of meals. And traditionally, cooked ham was very often part of that, or salami or pate, those kind of processed meats. And for a child, those bring in key nutrients. If you're going to
Mm-hmm.
say you can no longer have those, what are you going to put instead? Well, we already see that a lot of those sandwiches nowadays contain either chocolate based or jams or whatever. And if you ask, so what's the replacement? Well, they will say things like hummus, or, but that's not going to work.
Yeah.
There's a cultural place for those processed meats, at least in Europe, in some parts of Europe, and there's a nutritional place for those kind of products as well. And if
Mm-hmm.
and just saying we're going to take them out, well, it will come with trade-offs. It will come with, you have to replace it with something.
And
Um,
there's also this difference in the processed meat in the US versus Europe. In the US, to get the kind of high quality, minimally processed meat that you would find traditionally and even currently in many European countries, you need to go to Whole Foods or somewhere and spend a lot of money to get this really artisanal processed meat. Now, most of the lunch meat and stuff is highly processed. It's not the same thing that you're talking about. So I think that's the key important point. If you look at some of the evidence in the European context, processed meat is not the boogeyman, right? So, okay, can we talk now a little bit about the benefits of animal source food? So we've been talking about the concerns that have been raised. What are the unique properties? What do they contain that maybe are is difficult in plants?
Well, in a way, it's the mirror image of what we talked about before. Those nutrients that you find challenging on vegan diets. Well, those are the nutrients that are delivered by animal source foods. And it is just that our biological constitution is one where animal source foods seem to have an important place. And that's going back to the earliest moments when we started to move out of the forest into the savannas and shifted to those grasslands diet, where first marrow and carcasses were integrated into the diet, but eventually evolved into substantial intakes of animal source foods, to the point that our bodies, our anatomy, our physiology, our metabolism has adapted to it.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays we have some solutions in place to provide alternatives, but previously that wasn't possible. Vegan diets were just not feasible. And there's information coming from ancestral type diets. So Lauren Cordain and Neil Mann and others have done a few studies on this, where they showed you that, well, essentially, if you look at ancestral type diets that are of the hunter-gathering types, which are in a way evolutionary models for our for the human species, even though of course you can debate to which degree those contemporary hunter-gatherers are still models, but all those different societies or communities, they all had some animal source foods, and none of them were going below a certain threshold of, let's say, around 20% of your calories coming from animal source foods, and the median value was somewhere around 60-70%. If you go to the more the warmer climates, it may be around 50% or what, so that depends a bit on where you're looking at. obviously the
It's a lot more than zero, is what
yeah,
you're
a lot more
saying.
than zero. Yeah,
Around half
and a
to
lot more actually
two-thirds.
than we eat nowadays. So we all, even in the West, we present the West as a region now where people just indulge in red meat. It is lower than it used to be for ancestral humans in most
Yeah, it's
cases.
about a third in most of the sort of wealthier countries. It's about a third of calories from animal source foods.
Well, yes. So it's about 30% animal source foods and 70% plants, but which according to the ancestral model would be the lower limit, but still feasible. The problem, however, is that the 70% coming from plants is not of the greatest quality. Now,
It's
animals
mostly
have the
ultra processed in a
yeah,
lot
so
of
it's
contexts,
starches and oils and
or
sugar,
starches.
and there's a big issue on the plant side.
Hmm.
The animal side of things also has some issues, but at least animals, because they are at a higher trophic level, somehow up concentrate the nutrients. So there's more similarity between the animal foods we're having today and in the past. If you have an egg today or an egg in the past, it may differ a bit. Same for meat, but substantially it is same. It's a similar food.
Hmm.
The oils and sugars and starches we consume today are extremely different from the ones we were consuming in the past.
Yeah, we process plants to a greater extent than we do animals, right? In
And we
for
have
food.
to. We also have to, because the way we plants, if you look at the ancestral way of eating plants, that wouldn't probably also be very appealing nowadays. We'd be very fibrous, very difficult to get your nutrients out of those foods without elaborate processing. So it has been the logical continuation of the innovation in processing to get more out of those plant foods, but we've been overdoing it.
Right.
At least we've been overdoing it for the calories. We've been
Yeah.
sloppy about the nutrients.
Yeah, and one of these things that's very relevant to this discussion of how much we're talking about proportions of animal source foods has been this big push towards not just healthy, but also sustainable diets. And so many of these proposals or suggestions are trying to limit further and further how much animal source food is in the diet. Something about the 13 to 14% in the EAT-Lancet and the second EAT-Lancet commission, which came out recently. So, what do you think of that approach to sort of dietary guidelines and recommendations?
Well, Lancet and similar initiatives, I think, underestimate how messy and how contextual and how much in flux really the whole health, nutrition, diet, food production debate really is. And the Eat-Lancet diet is very heavily based on the views of Walter Willett, and the design of the diet is mostly based on what Willett thinks is the best for human health. And then they've used that diet and compared it to the planetary boundaries, and they came up with the conclusion that, well, it's also good for the planetary health. But what you really should do, I think, is to look at different solution space of different sustainable diets, and be much more relaxed and flexible about what can be considered healthy. They narrow it down a lot just because of the nutritional theory behind it. But then they throw out many other diets that could also be potentially sustainable. And let's not forget that also within the sustainability framework, it's not only about environmental health, it's also about human health, and it's also about prosperity and livelihoods and the societal side of things.
Hmm.
We need a much broader discussion than what Eat-Lancet is telling us. And there's some bizarre things in the Eat-Lancet diet. I haven't had the time to really look into the details of the second report, but one of the things I've
It's pretty
seen,
similar. It's the
yeah,
diet's pretty much the same.
there's some
Yeah,
small little differences, like a little
very
bit less
small differences.
whole grains, but there's also a remarkable thing. I was just looking at it before, that for fish and shellfish, now they have the level of this grams per day is more or less the same, about 30 grams per day, but the calories that are suggested have been reduced to 25 calories per day. Now that's one of the bizarre things. Also, why is fish so low? If this is the dietary design is based on health. Because if you have white fish, you can have a bit more, but if you have sardines or mackerel, if you have fatty fish, you very
But those
quickly
are the
hit.
healthy, those
Yeah,
fatty fish are the fish with bones in it, the small fish. Those are the healthier ones, right? Those have the long chain omega 3s.
right.
If
Yeah,
you have the bones, you have calcium,
but
and
if you
those are
have
the ones limited.
a calorie cap
Yeah.
of about 30 calories per day, that's about what is it? If you take yesterday, I was having herring. I was having two portions of herring, two herrings.
Mhm.
We eat them in kind of cured raw way almost in Belgium and the Netherlands, and I was having a double portion of herring. Now that is it's about what is it about 60, 70 grams per herring. So I must have had something like almost 150 grams of fish. Now 25 kilocals. That is about 10 grams of fatty fish, right?
Yeah.
So
You
those are.
were,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm just singling this one out just to say that um, the design of the diet as such is so one-sided and so um, so predefined that it doesn't allow you to play much with sustainable scenarios.
Yeah. So, and in their sort of defense, which you can listen, or you can go to the episode with Walter Willett, because I spoke with him about this, and I encourage you to do so, so you hear both perspectives. But it's presented as a flexible diet, which there are lots of ranges there. The problem is that it's very limited in terms of animal products, from my view, and that has a lot of challenges that come with it. So nutrient adequacy. I've done quite a bit of work, and there are major concerns over adequacy of certain micronutrients. Um, the feasibility, I think, is a huge one. What you were talking about in terms of what do people naturally want to consume, how much, when populations have enough money to buy what they want, they generally consume more than 13% of their calories from animal source foods. There's also some issues with the underlying data and the studies used to justify the health recommendations. So cohorts from the US, as you were talking about, very specific, and they're not necessarily generalizable, as well as some issues with modeling. So yeah, there are all sorts of, I think, challenges with that approach, but I think you and I can probably agree that we do need sustainable approaches to food systems. We need to be sustainable in terms of how we do that, and not just thinking about nutrition. We need to think about the environment. We need to think about the ethics. And you and I also worked on something you led previously that was called the Nourishment Table. Can you tell us a little bit about that approach to dietary guidance?
Yes, so the nourishment table builds on or tries to take into account a lot of the points we've discussed over the last minutes. So in a way, can we come up with a dietary framework that is respectful of the certainty of evidence? That's why we also had Bradley Johnston on board from from the Nutrirex consortium.
Mm-hmm.
That is respectful of variability and different findings in the nutritional epidemiology domain. That's why Andrew Mente was there from the Pure Studies. That factors in nutrient nutritional appropriateness, and doesn't put all the focus on all the weight on chronic disease. That is respectful of culture. And so we had a food historian in the group, and that also looks at processing, and that tries to give the maximum flexibility with respect to nutrition. So the diet or the dietary framework as such does not pretend to offer solutions with respect to sustainability, but it does open up the space so that people that are trying to find sustainable scenarios can land in that framework and use it accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, you end up with well, no, let me say this first. We then try to find a window, find somehow a way to look at human diets, because you can look at human diets in all sorts of different manners. You can look at sustainability, you can look at affordability, you can look at taste and flavor, so many different ways of looking at human diets. And what was singled out are two main dimensions: processing and nutrient density of the diet at the level of the diet. Why those two? Well, because first of all, those two are probably the main dimensions that originally made us human to begin with, because we started to process foods and we developed technology, and because we started to eat higher up the nutrient spectrum, higher up the trophic levels, and started to incorporate more animal source foods. And then it's, of course, those two discussions are among the most debated ones nowadays, with the NOVA classification on the and ultra processing on the one side, and then nutrient density correlating with the animal plant ratios, not perfectly, but still. And that correlates to also to the protein transition debate.
It's like we took abortion and religion and put them into one paper just to see how we can address those impossible topics.
Yes, yes. You take the controversial parts, and you see where you end up. And if you consider those two as the two axes of your field, then of your dietary domain, then what we can say with, I think, enough certainty, at least common sense, and because that's often underestimated in these discussions, I think just the amount of common sense and where we have, I think, a robust statement is stay away from those diets that are ultra processed. It doesn't say never touch an ultra processed food. For some cases it may even make sense. It may be, they may have benefits in some particular cases, but if your diet starts to be for the majority of its calories ultra processed, which is very common nowadays, and some people have up to 70-80% of their calories coming from ultra processed foods, that's probably not a safe zone to move into. Be very cautious if you do that. That's one conclusion of the paper. And then the other one is, if you move to the very low nutrient density levels of the diet, which means that you probably will be mostly basing your diet on cereal staples with a few inputs from higher nutrient dense foods, which are either from animal or plant origin, then you have also to be very careful. There's a hint there that if you go to a vegan diet, you probably end up on the left side. And in such cases, we didn't exclude that zone as something you have to absolutely avoid. If you want to go there, fine, but it's going to come with serious precautions. And in such a case, processing may actually be a big benefit for you, because the more you process those plant materials, the more you will extract from those plant materials. Unfortunately, if you really go all the way to the vegan side, to meet all your targets, there's some studies that seem to suggest that you probably will even have to include some ultra-processed foods to do it properly. Think about, protein isolates and protein powders, at least for some people. So, and then the rest, so whatever remains is essentially where you can operate at, as much as how you like and to which degree you like. We give the recommendation to get inspired by traditional diets. Why is that? Because traditional diets, in a way, have been time tested. They are almost Darwinian solutions on how to make the best of your how to create the best nutrition with the available resources in a specific region. It doesn't mean that you have to be dogmatic about it, because also traditional diets evolve, and the traditions of the past don't necessarily meet the needs of today. But they still can function as a source of inspiration. You may have to be careful with those diets that are all the way on the right side of the nutrient density spectrum, because in that case you will end up with probably diets that are almost exclusively carnivore. They can have their benefits for therapeutic reasons, but they may not be the ones that you recommend to populations as such. And of course, if you're going to just have a diet of ham and salami only and cheese, that's also probably not the best solution. So it's trying to refrain from being very specific about which foods you should eat in which quantities and to which degrees. Just stay away from the ultra processed parts, and then be sure you get all your vitamins, your minerals, and preferably through wholesome food approaches.
Yeah, I love the simplicity, because you really just have these two domains or these axes. You have, on the y-axis, you have this processing, which we're not saying processing is bad. It's that too much processing, the wrong kind of processing, excess processing, overall a diet consisting of primarily ultra processed foods is not okay. And you need some processing. So too little processing can be a problem as well. And on the other axis, you have these sort of nutrient density and a sort of proxy for animal source foods where too little is a problem, too much can be a problem. There's somewhere in the middle. So there's sort of this healthy, flexible middle ground where there's a lot of different options that can fit within there. And as you get further and further to any particular edge case, you have to pay attention to certain things. And I like that because it's quite a bit more flexible. It's not very prescriptive, but it gives people a simple framework for how to approach a healthy diet. So now let's say that people are convinced that animal source foods, meat and other products are not inherently bad, right? They have a lot of nutritional value and reasons to consume them. But let's say people are really concerned about the ethical and the environmental problems with meat production and other animal source foods. Can you respond sort of with what your vision is for the future? If not this sort of scenario where it's like techno fixes and a complete shift to these alternative proteins, what do you see as where we need to head?
Okay, so we probably have to separate those two discussions because the ethical and the environmental part are very different discussions. With respect to the ethical debate, I think it's about, maybe 10 years ago that I first started to look at this part of the conversation and published a few papers on that. And the ethical debates we're having now have a lot to do with the place that animal production is occupying in our current societies. So in one of those papers, we took a historical view and we started to outline the human animal relationship throughout the ages. So we're coming from a very rich background of hunter gathering. Again, I like the evolutionary lens because I think the evolutionary lens is very useful to properly understand where we're coming from, where we're heading, because we are often defining this conversation through a very narrow window of today. High-income country, there's a lot more going on, and a lot of what is going on is tracing back to deep-rooted effects from the past. So we come from this hunter-gatherer background where the relation between humans and animals was almost horizontal. Okay, so it was a transaction. You take an animal life and you give something in its place, whether that's a prayer or any other way of honoring the animal. It was a horizontal relationship of reciprocity. Then with the Neolithic and the emergence of farming, it became much more vertical. It became so the relationship became one of dominion, where the humans are, dominating, controlling the animal, but still with lots of respect, because the animal was considered to be sacred, was offered to the gods. So it was still a very meaningful relationship. Mm-hmm. Once we start to move in the industrial era, we start to commodify the animals. So they become objects. So from being a subject and then being subjected, they become objects. And the response to that situation is, for us humans, not easy. We then try to conceal the slaughterhouses, not look at them, pretend that they don't exist anymore. We have transformed meat, the eating of meat, into the eating of packed foods or specific cuts, and the animal background of our food is disappearing to the point that now that situation doesn't seem to hold anymore for some people, and it is turned into a confrontation. And so I'm telling you this because I think that if we're heading somewhere with the ethical debate, I think we need to have a more meaningful approach to the eating of animals, which we don't have nowadays because of the excessive commodification and the way we've been trying to hide that fact. And we should start evolving towards being more ethical omnivores, conscious omnivores, if we really want to get out of that situation, because we'll keep on bumping into the same problem.
I like that you're highlighting that we sort of lost touch with the production side and the relationship with the animal. We've said, oh, that's ugly and kind of bad, but we still want to eat meat, but we're going to push it out into, we don't want to think about it, we don't want to look at it. But what that's enabled is inhumane practices, a industrial system that treats these animals as objects, as commodities. And that's been what I think has led to a lot of the unethical practices. So we need to have a shift quite a bit in terms of how we think about and how we allow ourselves to maybe be more aware of the processes so that we can change them and make them more humane and ethical.
Well, now, there's that side, Ty, but there's also the fact that as a human being, eating animals is a problematic act. We're empathic, and if we're not able to give it a place in our worldview, it is a problematic thing to do. So also, even if it comes from the most humane background and it has been raised and slaughtered in the best possible ways, even then, I don't think it will be sufficient. I think we need to have again, the word is maybe not the best, but a more meaningful, richer relationship with animal foods. I personally try to do that as much as I can in a way that I'm a big proponent of regularly eating the less clean cuts, organ meats, or where you really, you're conscious of eating the animal. I do that regularly, not just because of its nutritional value, but also of the fact that it reminds me of what I'm doing. So I can do it with full awareness and embracing the act of eating meat, because I still think the human-animal relationship is a very profound one that we should cherish rather than reject it and abstract it.
Yeah, it's one of like appreciation, acknowledgement, yes. Saying this is very valuable. We want to partake of this and eat the entire animal. We want to be, really appreciate this precious thing that we have as something that is nourishing us, and not sort of put it out of our view and think, well, I'm just going to eat what I want for the flavor or whatever.
Yeah. Well, the way you have to deal with this is not easy, of course. How are you going to do this at population level? Well, education is an obvious way out, but I remember an incident that happened years ago in Germany, where some teachers decided that they wanted to do exactly that. They took a rabbit and they slaughtered it in front of a group of kids, just to explain where animals come from, and it created an outrage in Germany. The parents were upset, but then again, if you
should have chose a less cute animal.
Yeah,
that was the challenge.
Yeah, but the cuteness is part of the problem. The Disneyfication of the animals is not helping.
Right.
Anyway, so that's the ethical debate. So I think we need a different conversation. We need to give it place. We need to be more exposed to the origin of animal source foods and the profession of animal agriculture.
Well, and you know what? We don't actually know what the outcome of that would be. It is possible that there could be less animal source food consumption or less meat consumption if there's an awareness. I'm not sure. I think we'd have to see, but at least there would be attention to the ethical issues that are happening today. On the environmental side, now, another very common thing is to say that, animal source foods are either bad for the environment or they're worse for the environment than plant source foods. And so we should shift to as much plants as we can. What do you feel about, and what do you think about the evidence on that question?
Well, I think, again, we're simplifying the discussion a lot. It's so if you, it depends what you're talking about. Usually we see things through a carbon lens, right? It's all about the carbon. We do have issues that we need to fix, as we have to fix them for the plant side of things as well. I mean, there are a lot of unsustainable practices in the plant side of the binary too. But it depends what you look at. You can look at water, you can look at nutrient cycles and the disruption of nutrient cycles, nitrogen, phosphorus. You can look at biodiversity, land use, water wastage. There are many different sides. And they don't always necessarily move in the same direction if you try to fix one of them. So if you look, so carbon is the one that people usually talk about. Now, the numbers you see out there are completely hyperbolic very often. It's the biggest thing you can do for the planet and so forth. Now, in essence, the contribution of the entire animal agriculture section to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions is 12%. And that's about 7% direct emissions, and the rest is coming from land use change and so forth. That's so 12%, but it's not like you can just cut off the 12% if you go plant-based, because you will have to recover the nutrients and the food. So it will be a part of that 12%. And then it underestimates the progress we can still make. Because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. If we just scale up the animal health situation globally, because this is a global number, this 12%, right? If we scale up animal health, if we improve feed, if we improve herd management, there are many, many things we can do to quickly gain efficiency. We usually talk about emissions. We don't factor in the carbon sequestration, right? And it depends a lot on the management. How do you gonna, not because some management systems will be bad for sequestration and actually maybe release more carbon than they put into the soil, but others substantially offset the emissions. Some claim that it can be 100%. It depends really on what you're looking at. I think you had a discussion with Stanley Page, right, in one of your. So it's very management specific, but it's not only about emissions. We also do sequester. So that 12% has also to be related to what's put in the ground. And then there's the very important part of the natural baselines, especially for ruminants. Now, suppose you take out your ruminants from an ecosystem, whether you call it a farming system or whatever, you take out the animals and you rewild the place. Those wild animals will come with their own emissions. So especially pastoral systems worldwide are not really anthropogenic as such. Part of that is natural baseline, that if you would replace it with the herbivores that are there naturally, in many places it would almost be the exact same the same level. The fact that methane and CO2 are different gas, I mean, that could go on for a long time. So I'm just saying that the net effect you have here is not the major game changer that some people want it to be or make it to be. It is important. We have to reduce the emissions from animal agriculture, but we also have to contextualize that in the larger discussion of what will that mean for food security, what will that mean for ecosystem services, and make a fair evaluation of what that could look like, and be realistic about it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm having Pablo Manzano on next week to talk about those emissions. So I think we'll go into that in depth. And it's a really important point. There's also this issue that there's sort of an idealistic, very impractical assumption that if you just remove animals from the land, it would be replaced by these really sustainable rewilding initiatives that would offset emissions and all that stuff. And what's actually the reality is that much of our land where we have grazing animals is actually not really suitable for crop production, and the economics would drive what happens to that land most likely. And so oftentimes with well-managed livestock, they are actually contributing to a functioning ecosystem. There are really biodiverse grasslands that are in existence and maintained because of the livestock on the land. So in many contexts, if you were to remove them, what would replace them could be commercial or industry that is the opposite of preserving biodiversity. It could destroy the biodiversity. So I think that is often lost in these analyses like EAT-Lancet and others, where it's just really this oversimplified, I mean, it's very sophisticated, but it's missing sometimes the important trade-offs that would happen and what would realistically happen in if this was to be implemented in the real world.
Yes, so. And another one is putting trees instead of having the grazers, right? Which is just assuming that you can just afforest the entire planet, because forest, I mean, I'm sure Pablo will talk about it, but the forest is seen as a natural symbol in a way, but it doesn't always make sense in all places of of the planet, and it can end up as a monoculture. It can be destructive to the soil, and it may increase the risk of wildfires if you don't graze your environment properly.
Yeah, Paige Stanley and I talked about that, and really there are, if we think about the type of ecosystem, many rangelands would be better off being grasslands and not being converted to forest, because it's a more resilient form of carbon storage when it's sort of dependent more on the below ground carbon, not just the biomass from trees above ground, right? Like you said, risk of forests and forest fires.
Yeah. But that being said, I think there's still room, of course, to improve the animal system. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like everything is fine either. There's still room to improve the production systems, but carbon is only part of it. We have to think about, fixing those nutrient cycles again, making the best out of the feed food competition. There's certainly
there's a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on the ethical side, on the environmental side, and even on the nutrition side in terms of the way that these products are processed, what we have out there. But it does not mean that animal source foods like meat are inherently bad. That's sort of not my view. I think they're very nourishing, and they play an important role because we sort of evolved to consume both animal and plant sources. And when you go too low in either, you really expose yourself to issues, whether that's nutrient deficiencies or issues of chronic disease. So thank you, Dr. Frédéric Leroy. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you for having me, Ty.